this lesson we'll learn how we can start to use particle modifiers inside of Cinema 4D. Okay, so at this point now we have our particles that have been set up and placed inside of our scene. Now, as I mentioned at the end of our previous lesson, the problem that we have right now is that these particles really just sort of look like they're moving through a vacuum. They really don't have any sense of weight or any wind resistance to these. So let's come in and I'll maybe take my timeline, maybe narrow this down to a little smaller area of time. Okay, very nice. So let's come in and start to add in some of these particle modifiers. So these can be found under the Simulate menu, under Particles, and they can be found underneath our emitter. So you can see there's a number of modifiers here that we can start to use. Let's first start with something like gravity. Okay, so all we have to do is drop the gravity into our scene, and at that point, now as soon as we start to play this back, you can see now the gravity is pulling these particles down. There we are, very nice. Now the rate at which these particles will fall can be determined by this acceleration. So if we want maybe some particles that seem to be really light, we can drop that acceleration down. You can see it just sort of barely pulls those down. In this case, almost not at all. But in my case, just to keep things a little bit more realistic, I'm going to leave this at about 250, which is actually the default value. So that is actually visually looking pretty good. Again, just sort of a cloud of steam that is maybe sort of falling down toward the ground. It's not really falling all that fast. In my case, this is actually looking pretty good. Okay, so now we at least have some gravity working here. Now, one of the things that we really don't have in this scene is any effect of wind or air turbulence. This is still almost sort of treating these particles like they're sort of in a vacuum. And again, that almost never happens in real life. So let's come in, back to our Simulate menu, and let's add in turbulence. Okay, now let's come in and play this back. Now you can see this turbulence is actually sort of spreading these particles out. You can see it's giving them just a little bit of randomization. We can come in here and start to increase our strength. We can start to increase our scale. There we go, and you can see how it's really just kind of spreading these particles out and giving them just a little bit more of a sort of a random appearance. Again, just sort of like they're being blown around by wind. There we go. Now in my case, I really would like to make this look a little bit stronger. Again, something like steam or smoke, it's going to be really, really light and really easily moved by any amount of wind. So I'm going to come in and take this strength, maybe boost this up to something relatively high, maybe between 40 and 50. There we go. And you can start to see how that really starts to give us this kind of a really randomized, really, really turbulent effect. Now in my case, this scale, we might start to bring that down a little bit because it seems like that might be a little bit strong. So with the scale, as we start to bring this down, we're basically getting a little bit smaller kind of pattern in here. As you start to increase that scale, you can really start to see the effect of that turbulence in these really, really large patterns that it's starting to create as far as wind patterns. So in my case, that's probably a little bit high. So I'm going to bring that down, maybe something like 70 or 80. That kind of makes that wind pattern a little bit smaller, but still pretty natural. Very, very nice. So now we're starting to get something that is moving in some random patterns. It looks like it's really being blown by the wind. It's got this kind of a random direction in all of it. It really does sort of look like steam or sort of a cold fog that's sort of falling and then being blown around. So lots and lots of things that we can start to do with these particles inside of Cinema 4D. And you can see by just adding a little bit of gravity and a little bit of air turbulence, that's completely changed the appearance or the overall behavior of my particles. Now, the last thing I want to do before I wrap up this lesson is you can see right now these particles are really just sort of falling through the ground. So that may not be a problem for us in this instance, where as this little vertical takeoff vehicle starts to pull away, you can see in my case the camera actually moves to a point where we don't even see the particles sitting on this little tarmac surface. So in my case, that's really not a problem. The particles are passing through, but in your scenes, that could be an issue where you may not really want that. So if we wanted to keep our particles localized on this surface, we can use another modifier. So let's go to Simulate, back to Particles, and let's add in a deflector. So our deflector is actually a little surface here, and you can see that kind of represented by this little square. Now if we come in, we can take that deflector, maybe scale that up to a larger size. We could either do this with our scale tool, or if we go into the deflector, we can adjust the size right here as well. I'm going to come in and make this fairly large so it covers most of that tarmac surface. And I'll take this and rotate that down maybe 90 degrees. In my case, I'm going to jump to my top view now. Move this sort of back underneath here if we need to. It doesn't really have to be perfect. Again, in my case, we're really not even going to see these particles on the surface anyway. But just to make sure that we have everything where it needs to be. Alright, let's try that. So I'll go back to my perspective view. Now play this through. And now you can see wherever this deflector is, it's actually stopping those particles from passing through. Now really important, you want to make sure that this deflector is fully covering the areas that you want, because you can see as soon as these particles pass over this deflector, they just fall right through. So this deflector really needs to cover everything and all the particles that you want to make sure don't get away or fall through. There we go. Very nice. So we may have a few of these little guys still escaping, and in my case that's probably because I have this deflector sitting up a little bit too high. And once we hit a certain point in our animation where this hose is sort of laying down on its side, it's possible that the particle emitter is actually down low enough to where it's actually, yeah, you can see it's actually getting some of those particles underneath that deflector. So in my case, I'll just take that deflector and pull this down a little bit more to make sure that it totally blocks that emitter. There we go. Now you can see it's pretty much blocking all of that. Now the one thing that we are starting to get now is the fact that these particles are just sort of bouncing all over the place. You can see they hit this emitter or this deflector and sort of bounce around. It looks more like rice or something really bouncy. So what we can do is take that deflector, and it does have this bounce attribute. Let's maybe take this down to something really low. Again, in my case, because this is something that is trying to look a little bit more gaseous, it's really not going to bounce. It's really just kind of going to hit the surface and just kind of flow right along. So now by taking that bounciness down, that starts to look, in my case, much more natural. Very nice. So you can see where now these particles start to look a lot better as far as trying to mimic the behavior of something that is a little bit more gaseous and sort of cloudy. So what we'll do in our next lesson is really just finish up with a few sort of final touches, and then we'll be ready to get into some of the rendering components of these particles.